All right, welcome to another episode of the Legal Lowdown. I am your host, Matthew R. Carpenter, an attorney, and today we are diving deep into the world of ESG, which stands for Environmental Social Governance. For those of you who don't know, the American Corporate Code requires for-profit companies to prioritize one thing above all else: profits. You guessed it. But the intense urge to maximize profits can at times put other important considerations at risk. Like, let's say, the environment. The heat dome is hot. I know you feeling it. It's piercing my skin. And that takes care of the E in ESG. But let's not forget about the S. This covers human rights, human capital management, how corporate policies basically impact people outside of the company and the employees that work within. So in this era, when we think about ESG regulatory policy, what truly comes to mind? Well, imagine you're trying to sell a ship, right? But the map keeps changing, and maybe half the lighthouses that you bet your bottom dollar on are out. And that's exactly what's happening in the ESG regulatory landscape right now, right? It's complicated, and things are shifting due to new administrative priorities. So let's get into it. With this ever-shifting world of environmental social governance rules, ESG, let's look at what has happened in the United States from a federal level, then a state level, and then maybe we'll consider some things that are happening overseas, right? And so here at home, on the federal level, it looks like things are really starting to slow down for ESG protocols, right? The federal picture seems to have hit the pause button for ESG, so to speak. According to my sources, the big SEC enhanced climate disclosure rules that were on the horizon are now stayed. That's right. In the face of many legal challenges and, a new administration signaling maybe a different direction away from these big federal ESG mandates, we are now seeing the slowing down of key SEC environmental policies, right? So yeah, implementing that specific rule seems like, let's say, highly unlikely now. And the stayed effect or the slowed effect that you're seeing is not just affecting environmental, right? It suggests that other broader ESG efforts from the SEC, things like rules that target private funds, requiring them to comply with ESG protocols, are less likely now. And we talked about human rights and human management capital earlier. You have to realize that things like corporate board diversity, for example, fall underneath an umbrella. And those initiatives are probably going to be deprioritized too. Less compliance work, right? Makes things a little bit cheaper, fewer immediate burdens. But this has a flip side, like everything in life, right? It also means less regulatory certainty. Makes long-term planning quite difficult for companies, actually. Okay, so federal regs are slowing down, they're snoozing. But, this is where it gets really interesting. With the feds going quiet, the states are stepping up in a big way when it comes to ESG. California, you might have guessed, is really taking the wheel here. They've got mandatory climate disclosures coming online at a rapid pace. You got S-Bill 253 that's focused on emissions reporting, both direct and indirect. And then you have SB 261, which is all about climate-related financial risk. It causes us to ask questions like, how does climate change actually impact the company's bottom line? And who does this actually affect outside the company? But these laws don't just affect California companies, guys. That's the key part. They affect companies doing business in California, which doesn't mean that you have to be located or incorporated in California, just that your products might be directed towards California. So which, when you look at it, turns out to be, something like 10,000 companies, which equates to about 75% of the Fortune 1000. If you didn't know it was a thing, the Fortune 1000 is a thing. So this California regulation, these regulations, actually become the U.S. standard by default. So even companies outside of California have to pay attention, including dealing with the scope of their emissions, which, some people are very happy about, others could care less. But how does California have this much sauce, you might ask, if you're me, right? To the point where it's literally lost in the sauce. Well, California's economy is actually the largest in the United States. And if you really want gold fever, consider this. California's economy is actually estimated to be among the top 5 largest economies in the world. So if you're a major American company, you basically have to play ball. Okay, so right now there's ongoing litigation though in California, and particularly litigation against the CARB, the California Air Resources Board. Their rulemaking has been delayed as a result. So that delay means companies might be able to relax, but I wouldn't bet on it. You may still want to comply or prepare to comply, starting as early as this year, 2025. And to do so, you'll likely need to show good faith efforts, basically document that you're trying to get ready for environmental protocols, maybe social governance protocols, even if all the final rules aren't quite nailed down yet. And it's not just California that is pushing this initiative and causing companies to have to prepare. There are other states as well, Colorado, Illinois, even Florida, following suit in some ways with legislation of their own. Oh, Florida. Oh, Florida. So, they're leaning into, though, to be serious, the pro-ESG measures as well. So that's pretty cool. But then you have the other side of the coin, the anti-ESG push, which you're also ironically seeing some of that in Florida. And there's quite a bit of this anti-ESG push happening throughout the United States. Over 40 bills working their way through Congress or working their way through state legislatures in 21 states, mostly aimed at financial institutions, trying to restrict ESG considerations. It creates this really complex, often conflicting policy environment. In many cases, if you receive state funding in these anti-ESG domains or jurisdictions, you will be prevented from boycotting companies that deprioritize ESG. So let me break this down in another way, right? If you are an entity that receives state funding, then basically you can't refuse or boycott business with a company that doesn't prioritize ESG, right? Like if you only want to do business with a company that prioritizes the environment or prioritizes human capital, you can't have those preferences anymore if you want to keep that state funding. So, from a macro level, it's like a legislative tug of war between the states. How does a company even manage to comply? Facing restrictions here, complying there, that's the $1 million question. It's really underlining why companies need strong internal governance, maybe like a ESG steering committee, just to track all these divergent state rules. And sources say that the big problem within companies is specifically that they can't track these rules very effectively, right? They don't know what the standards are. They don't know how to comply, and they don't know how to prepare their employees. Sounds like they could use an attorney. And guys, you can't just wait for the feds anymore in this patchwork compliance framework. You got to be proactive. That's the best way to keep your company in good standing and to keep those dollars rolling in. Okay, so let's shift gears. Let's go international. I promise you that after we hit the federal perspective and after we hit the state side perspective, I was going to take you overseas. I was going to fly you out. Okay, so, the U.S. is fragmented, but the EU, for example, has had pretty comprehensive ESG rules for a while now. They have the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that really props up reporting requirements, transparency. And then the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which requires in-scope companies, so companies that fall underneath the law, which can be European countries, but also foreign countries as well. Foreign to the European Union, meaning American companies. They have to basically identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for human rights and environmental risks across their operations and value chains. But things are changing even in the EU, right? The EU is kind of going in a trajectory that's similar to the United States, just at a lesser degree. So they just recently had this Omnibus Act, this Omnibus Simplification Package, to be more precise, that came out earlier this year, or was slated to come out earlier this year, and it may significantly reduce the scope of CSRD and CSDDD. So the EU is putting, its regulations on a bit of a diet plan. It's maybe even better seen as a strategic refinement, focusing the heaviest requirements on the biggest players, right? Perhaps it doesn't mean they're abandoning ESG, more like they're maturing their approach. It's well seasoned, guys. So even with the EU adjustment, we still have this complex global picture. Federal pause in the USA, states going in a different direction, right? And then the EU refining things. So how can businesses actually manage all this, practically speaking? Despite all the uncertainty and the moving parts, guys, the advice is still fundamentally about preparation and good governance. Prior preparation prevents poor performance. Duh. Strengthening those internal frameworks, like we mentioned, that ESG steering committee, guys. Don't be afraid to lean on external help. Consultants, trade associations, and attorneys too. They track this stuff full time. Well, they should be. And definitely look at streamlining your data collection, right? Like I talk about AI technology and autonomous technologies all the time on this channel. So digital tools, maybe even AI-driven software, can make a huge difference in your accuracy. Just handling the sheer volume of data and staying proactive can help out quite a bit. Proactive compliance, that is the phrase of the day. And even if the rules are still developing, like in California, showing you're actively working on it, that's key. That's going to be key, I promise you. So wrapping all this up, it's really a complex tapestry, isn't it, right? Federal pauses, state level surges, and international tweaks, all tied up with a neat little bow. It really is, when you think about the big picture, you see like a rapidly changing landscape. But even so, compliance shouldn't be the only reason companies focus on ESG. There's a huge agreement among C-suite executives, something like 97%, that sustainability reporting actually creates real business value beyond just ticking off the boxes, right? And that's such an important point because society sometimes feels, especially the populace, that the corporations don't care. But I think some of this data is suggesting that behind closed doors, they do. And they're just trying to figure out a way to balance the corporate code incentive or directive to maximize the bottom line against ESG proposals. And all of this really boils down to managing risks, building resilience, finding value. And so for you, the listener, the most important person in the room right now, maybe the final thought is this. In this constantly shifting legal landscape, where are the new opportunities for companies that look beyond ESG as just a burden and see it as a real strategic advantage? What can they be doing to make sure their policies support the bottom line while creating real-time value for ESG initiatives? And as a matter of fact, are those two goals even congruent in this era? Just something for you to think about. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Legal Lowdown.